coming up. The sympathetic cord is going to come from the cavities and come up here into the neck and run alongside the carotid and terminate right up here in the superior cervical ganglion, or cranial cervical ganglion as they call it, which is going to be right up here. That's the end of the cord. And then it's vagus nerve beyond that up to the skull. When you get down here, the sympathetic cord, okay, so here's the caudal cervical, this is probably stellate ganglion here, and the caudal cervical ganglion is usually right next to it, right up in here. Those are on the sympathetic cord. At this point, the vagus has split off the cord, so it's not a trunk anymore. Vagosympathetic trunk here splits up as we get into the thorax, and the vagus nerve follows the trachea and goes down to innervate the lungs, the bronchi, the heart, and then continues down into the abdominal cavity. The sympathetic chain drops down, see where these ganglia are? It drops down right here once you get into the thoracic cavity, and then it goes right along the vertebrae. So that if you look just behind the parietal pleura, you'll see that this little cord right here continues all the way down there, and it's underneath that pleura, and it goes all the way down into the abdominal cavity. Those are where the chain ganglia are, the sympathetic chain, or the sympathetic cord. So the vagus right here and the sympathetic cord come together to form the vagosympathetic trunk.
And then they're both down here too? Correct.
The vagus you won't find down here because it splits up into a lot of branches going to all the viscera. The sympathetic cord will continue right down next to the vertebrae, the vertebral bodies.
Okay.
All the way down into the sacrum, actually.
Cool.
And which one's
Let's hear it for the autonomic nervous system.
Bam!
Where's the costocervical trunk? Or which one's that one?
In that view, seriously?
I'm sorry, was I supposed to be getting your face?
You're going to get a lot more than that. The costocervical trunk for both the vein and the artery runs right to the first rib and splits around it. In the artery, it comes from the subclavian artery. So here's the subclavian here, and you can see this little vessel here coming to the first nerve and then the first rib, and then there's a vessel that goes above and a vessel that goes below. This is the highest intercostal artery. This vessel that goes above is the deep cervical. So it's called the costocervical trunk. This vessel that comes off the subclavian, actually yours is kind of a little different. So here's the costocervical trunk way up here, because if I look at this one, this is the deep cervical. And this one splits up, but it's intercostal arteries. This portion that I pointed to would be the highest intercostal, because it's really going around here. This goes cranial to the rib and goes forward. And deep to it, coming off the dorsal surface of the subclavian here, this vessel is going cranially and kind of dorsally. It's at an angle like that, and it dives into the vertebral column, and it'll have a vein right here going with it. This is the vertebral vein and vertebral artery. So the subclavian is going to have this little costocervical trunk. It's going to have the internal thoracic. It's going to have the vertebral, and then it'll give off one that comes up to the surface of the neck, the superficial cervical. See right here? Superficial cervical. Then the subclavian passes the rib here and becomes the axillary. And the axillary is going to give off a lateral thoracic and a subscapular and become the brachial.
It's an important neighborhood.